The night my mother walked in on my father and me changed everything. It wasn't just a look or a lingering gaze. She caught us in a moment that no one should ever witness. We thought we were alone, that no one would ever know. But the door creaked open, and there she stood. The shock. The betrayal. It all happened so fast. In that instant, everything came crashing down around us. Growing up, my relationship with my father always felt special, even unique. To everyone else, we seemed like the perfect father-son duo, always inseparable. From weekend fishing trips to late-night talks about life, he was the one person who never let me down. I thought that's just how it was supposed to be. Fathers were meant to be dependable, supportive, and always present, right? At least, that's what I believed. But my mother, she was different. She loved us in her own distant way, but she was often more of a presence in name than in person. Her career pulled her away, and even when she was around, she felt distant, as if her mind was always elsewhere. My father would often excuse her with phrases like, "She's just tired," or "Work's been tough on her." For years I accepted it. But as I grew older, I began to understand the truth. She wasn't really there, not in the ways that mattered. My father, always the pillar, was the one who stepped in to fill that void. I didn't realize it then, but that void would set the stage for everything that followed. One evening, we sat together in the living room. The air was cool, and the silence between us was familiar, almost comforting. I don't remember what we were watching on TV. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way he looked at me. It wasn't the first time I'd caught him watching me like that, but this time, the look lasted longer than usual. It was soft but intense, as if he were seeing me in a way he hadn't before, or maybe in a way I hadn't noticed until now. I shifted in my seat, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. "Dad?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked slightly, betraying the unease that had started to settle in. He smiled, the kind of smile that usually reassured me. But now, it only heightened the tension. "Nothing," he said, turning back to the TV. But his gaze returned to me moments later. I could feel it without even looking his way. The strange part was, instead of feeling uncomfortable, a part of me liked it. It felt wrong to even think that way, but there was a warmth in his attention that I craved, especially in a house where my mother barely noticed if I was there or not. My father, on the other hand, always made me feel seen, like I was the only person who mattered in the room. As days passed, those lingering moments became more frequent. There was always something unspoken between us, something that hung in the air whenever we were alone together. It was as if we were dancing around something, both of us aware, but neither willing to address it. It was subtle at first, a hand brushing against mine, a glance that lasted just a little too long, the way he'd sit just a bit closer than necessary. Each time, my heart would skip a beat, and I found myself thinking about it long after the moment had passed. Then, one night, everything changed. The rest of the transcript is long, so I'll break it into smaller sections for clarity. Let me know if you'd like me to continue refining this way or adjust anything further. Then, one night, everything changed. I had just finished dinner and was heading upstairs to my room when I heard my father call out from the living room. "Hey, can you come here for a second?" His voice was calm, like always, but there was an undertone to it that made me pause. I walked into the room and saw him sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand. The light was dim, casting shadows across his face. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me the same way he had been for weeks now, as if he were waiting for something. "Sit down," he said, patting the space next to him. I hesitated but eventually sat, trying to act casual even though my heart was pounding in my chest. He didn't speak for a while, and the silence between us stretched on. I could feel the tension growing, and I wasn't sure if it was just in my head or if he felt it too. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I've noticed things have been different between us lately." My stomach tightened. I had no idea where this conversation was going, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, setting his glass down on the coffee table. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, "but I think you feel it too." There it was, the unspoken truth hanging in the air between us. I felt like I should say something, deny it, pretend like I didn't know what he was talking about. But I couldn't. I couldn't lie to him. I nodded slowly, my throat tight with emotion. "Yeah," I whispered. "I feel it." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, he reached out and placed his hand on mine. It was such a small gesture, something he'd done a million times before. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like more. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I let his hand linger there, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. It was wrong. Every fiber of my being told me that. But I couldn't deny the way it made me feel. From that moment on, everything between us changed. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, over the course of the next few weeks, we started spending even more time together. We found excuses to be alone, whether it was late-night conversations on the porch or quiet moments in the car after running errands. There was always something unspoken between us, something that made my heart race every time we were close. I tried to push it away, to tell myself that it was just a phase, that I was overthinking things. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew. And it wasn't just me. My father felt it too. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the way his hand would linger on my shoulder a little too long, or the way he'd find reasons to touch me, even in the smallest ways. It wasn't long before those innocent touches became something more. Something that neither of us could deny. I'll continue refining the next part. Let me know if you have any preferences or need adjustments so far. From that night on, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. I would wake up in the morning, go about my day, and yet every interaction with my father carried a different weight to it. I became hyper-aware of his presence, and no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had begun between us. It was like a slow burn, a flame that had ignited but hadn't yet reached its full intensity. Still, I could feel the heat. My mother, as usual, remained mostly absent. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was more that she was caught up in her own world. Work consumed her, social events drained her, and by the time she was home, it felt like she was only a ghost passing through the house. We hardly exchanged words anymore, and when we did, they were shallow, surface-level exchanges about mundane things like groceries or appointments. It was as if there was an invisible wall between us, one I couldn't even begin to break down. My relationship with her was strained, but I never thought much of it until now, until my father's attention had started to fill the void. One evening, a few weeks after that quiet conversation on the couch, my father and I found ourselves alone again. My mother had gone out to attend some gala, leaving us to another night of watching TV and pretending like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. We didn't talk about it, but it was there, lingering between us. We were sitting close, much closer than usual, and I could feel the electricity in the air. He turned toward me at one point, his eyes soft but focused, and I couldn't look away. There was a moment, brief but powerful, where the space between us felt too small, like we were on the edge of something we couldn't turn back from. He didn't touch me, but the way his gaze lingered was enough to make my heart race. "I've been thinking about what we talked about," he said quietly, breaking the silence. I swallowed hard, unsure of where this conversation was headed but knowing full well that we couldn't avoid it any longer. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His hand rested on his knee, so close to mine that if either of us shifted even slightly, we would have been touching. The tension was suffocating, and yet I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want the moment to end. "We don't have to figure it all out," he said, his voice low and calm. "But I think we both know this is different." Different. That word echoed in my mind. It was the only way to describe what had been happening, this slow but steady shift between us. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and yet it felt oddly natural, like it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. "I know," I said softly, staring down at my hands as if they held the answers. "But what do we do about it?" He hesitated, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was just as confused as I was. For the first time, I realized that he wasn't in control of this situation either. We were both caught in something bigger than ourselves, something neither of us could fully understand. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice almost fragile. "But we'll figure it out together." Together. That word brought a strange comfort, even though it also scared me. This wasn't just a passing feeling. It was something that had the potential to change everything. And yet, there was a part of me that wanted to see where it would go. Maybe that was what frightened me the most, the fact that I didn't want to stop it. Let me know if you'd like the continuation or if you'd like any adjustments. As the days passed, our dynamic continued to evolve. We spent more and more time together, finding excuses to be alone, whether it was long drives, late-night conversations, or simply sitting in silence. There was always an undercurrent of tension, a feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Neither of us addressed it directly, but it was always there, lingering in the quiet moments, in the unspoken glances, in the subtle shifts of body language. One night, everything came to a head. My mother had left town for a business trip, leaving my father and me alone in the house for the weekend. It was the perfect storm. No distractions, no interruptions. Just the two of us, with nothing but time and a growing tension that was impossible to ignore. We had just finished dinner, and I was cleaning up in the kitchen when my father walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me with that familiar look in his eyes, the one that sent a thrill through me every time I caught it. "You don't have to do that," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. I shrugged, trying to play it cool even though my heart was pounding. "It's no big deal. I'm almost done." He took a step closer, and I could feel the air shift between us. The room felt smaller, the space between us shrinking by the second. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "Let's just relax. You've been working all day." I hesitated for a moment, but the way he was looking at me made it impossible to say no. I dried my hands and followed him into the living room, where he sat down on the couch, leaving just enough space for me to sit beside him. It was an invitation, unspoken but clear, and I accepted it without hesitation. We sat there in silence for a while, the TV on but neither of us paying attention. I could feel his presence beside me, the warmth radiating from him, and it was all I could do to keep my composure. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but I didn't know what to say. Instead, I let the quiet fill the room, knowing that whatever was about to happen was inevitable. He shifted slightly, turning toward me, and I felt the brush of his arm against mine. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to look at him, meeting his gaze. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us thick and palpable. Neither of us spoke, but in that silence, everything was said. We both knew what was happening, what had been happening for weeks now. There was no denying it anymore. Then, without a word, he reached out, his hand resting on my knee. The touch was gentle, tentative, as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see how I would react. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the moment linger, let the weight of his hand settle against me, and in that instant, something shifted between us. It was as if the barrier that had been holding us back had finally broken, and there was no turning back. I looked down at his hand, my heart racing. When I looked back up at him, his expression was soft, almost vulnerable. It was a side of him I had never seen before, and it only made the moment more intense. "Let me know if you'd like me to continue." I could feel the air between us growing thicker, the tension building with every passing second. "We don't have to," he started, his voice hesitant. But I cut him off. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I want to." It was the truth. As terrifying as it was to admit, I wanted this. I wanted him in a way I couldn't fully explain. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the confusion, not the fear, not the uncertainty of what would come next. All that mattered was the two of us here and now. He didn't say anything in response, but the look in his eyes said it all. He leaned in slightly, his hand still resting on my knee. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. The room around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in this charged, intimate moment. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, he pulled back, his hand slipping away from my knee. The spell was broken, and we were back in reality. The moment hung between us like a question that had yet to be answered. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice soft but pained. "I shouldn't have." But I shook my head, cutting him off again. "No," I said firmly. "Don't apologize. We both know this isn't just nothing." That night felt different from the beginning, even before anything actually happened. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks but now seemed to pulse around us. My father had been quieter than usual at dinner, his eyes lingering on me with a weight that made my skin prickle. I couldn't tell if it was guilt, desire, or something else entirely. But whatever it was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both waiting for something neither of us could stop. After dinner, my father suggested we watch a movie together. I agreed, even though I wasn't interested in whatever was playing on the screen. My mind was too preoccupied with him, his every movement, every word. We settled on the couch, and I could feel the familiar tension return, thick and unavoidable. The TV flickered in the background, but it was just noise. The only thing I was focused on was him and the strange shift between us. At some point during the movie, my father shifted closer to me. His arm brushed against mine, sending a shiver down my spine. It was such a small, seemingly innocent action, but it felt loaded with meaning. I could feel my heart racing, my breath quickening, and I knew he felt it too. He wasn't watching the screen anymore, either. He reached over and let his hand rest on my knee, a gesture that could have been fatherly on any other night, but tonight, it felt different. His fingers lingered, pressing into my skin. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my hand move over his, wordlessly accepting the touch. The room seemed to shrink around us. Every sound, the hum of the TV, the rustling of his clothes as he shifted, faded away, leaving only the two of us. We were suspended in a moment that felt both dangerous and inevitable. His fingers tightened slightly around mine, a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear, hesitation, and something else. Something darker, something I hadn't seen in him before. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the space between us charged with a tension that felt like it was about to snap. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, his voice rough and low, barely audible. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to stop him, didn't want to break the fragile moment we were suspended in. So, I just shook my head. "You won't," I whispered back, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. For a moment, he didn't move, as if he were weighing the consequences of what was about to happen. But then, slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned in. His lips brushed mine, soft, tentative, testing. It wasn't what I had expected, and yet it was exactly what I had been waiting for. It was as if all the tension, all the unspoken emotions between us, finally found their release in that simple, delicate kiss. It was brief, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it was enough to set my entire body on fire. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, waiting for some sign that I was okay with this, that I wanted it as much as he did. I didn't hesitate. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us again, this time with more certainty. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more insistent. His hands found their way to my face, cradling it gently. But there was nothing gentle about the way he kissed me now. It was filled with a need, a hunger that I had never felt from him before. My own hands moved to his chest, feeling the solid weight of him beneath my fingertips. He was so close now, so real, and yet it still felt surreal, like I was dreaming. As the kiss intensified, everything else fell away. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty. Only the two of us, tangled together on the couch, lost in a moment that felt both forbidden and necessary. His hand slid from my face, down my neck, and then lower. His touch ignited every nerve in my body. We broke apart for a moment, both of us gasping for air. His forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, against my skin. For a split second, I thought he might stop, might pull away and pretend like this never happened. But then his hands were on me again, more insistent now, more certain, and I didn't want him to stop. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, his eyes locked on mine. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it, but I didn't care. I wanted this. I wanted him, in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. My own hands found their way to his back, pulling him closer, needing to feel him against me. The world outside didn't exist anymore. There was only this moment, this impossible, undeniable connection between us. His lips moved from my mouth, trailing down my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I arched against him, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I had never felt anything like this before, this intensity, this raw need that seemed to consume both of us. And yet, it felt right, like everything that had happened between us had been leading to this moment. He pulled back for a moment, his eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't quite name. Desire, fear, guilt. It was all there, written across his face. But none of it was enough to stop him. I didn't need to be asked. I followed his lead, pulling my own shirt off and tossing it aside without a second thought. The space between us disappeared entirely, our bodies pressed together in a way that felt both foreign and completely natural. Every touch, every kiss, every movement felt electric, like we were both teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. And yet, neither of us pulled back. We couldn't. We were too far gone, too lost in the moment to stop now. And then, all at once, it happened. The tension snapped, and we were both lost, consumed by the moment, by each other. I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. It was as if we were one, moving together in perfect, undeniable sync. For a long time, we just lay there, our bodies tangled together, the room silent except for the sound of our breathing slowly returning to normal. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. But in the quiet, I knew that everything had changed. This wasn't something we could undo, something we could pretend didn't happen. We had crossed a line, one that neither of us could come back from. He shifted beside me, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle now, almost reverent, and for the first time since this all began, I felt a twinge of fear, not of him, but of what came next. We lay there in the quiet aftermath, the room still and warm. The intimacy of the moment had left a lingering haze over everything, like the air had thickened with the weight of what we'd done. I could feel the steady rise and fall of my father's chest beneath me, his breathing soft and shallow, as if he too was trying to process everything. There was no talking. What could we say? Words felt unnecessary in the aftermath of something so charged, so forbidden. I let out a breath, my fingers still curled around his arm, not wanting to move, not wanting to break the fragile stillness that had settled over us. His hand rested on my back, steady and reassuring, but there was a quiet tension in his muscles, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. I should have felt guilt, maybe even shame, but all I felt was the strange calm that had wrapped around me, like we were in a world all our own. There was no one else, just the two of us, hidden from the rest of the world. I knew this feeling couldn't last, that reality would eventually come crashing in. But for now it was just us, and that was enough. But then I heard it, a soft creak, barely perceptible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I froze. The sound had come from the hallway. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, a figment of the paranoia that had been creeping at the edges of my consciousness since the beginning. But then I heard it again, louder this time, the unmistakable sound of a door opening, followed by footsteps, soft and deliberate. My heart stopped. I pushed myself up slightly, my body going cold as I realized what it meant. My mother. She was supposed to be out, but the sound of those footsteps was all too real, and now they were getting closer. Panic surged through me, flooding my veins like ice. I turned to my father, my eyes wide with fear. He looked at me, confusion flashing across his face for a brief second before the reality of the situation hit him too. He sat up abruptly, pulling the blanket over us in a frantic motion, as if that could somehow erase what had just happened. The room was too quiet now, the tension unbearable as we waited, frozen in place, for the inevitable. And then the door opened. There she was, standing in the doorway, her face a mask of shock and horror that seemed to freeze time itself. My mother, the woman who had brought me into this world, who had raised me, who had trusted us, stood there, staring at the scene before her with an expression I would never forget. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room entirely, leaving us all suspended in a terrible, gut-wrenching silence. I could see her trying to make sense of what she was seeing, her mind struggling to comprehend the unimaginable. Her eyes darted between us, taking in every detail, every awful truth that was laid bare before her. The confusion gave way to something else, something far worse. Her face crumpled, her lips parting as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. She just stared at us, her hands trembling at her sides. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The sound seemed to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the betrayal in them was like a punch to the gut. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her entire body trembling as if she couldn't control it. Then, slowly, she took a step forward, her gaze never leaving mine. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, her lips quivering as she tried to form words. How could you?" she finally choked out, her voice breaking on the last word. I didn't have an answer. My throat was tight, and my chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of her devastation. I glanced at my father, hoping he would say something, do something, anything to stop this nightmare from spiraling further. But he was just as frozen as I was, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear that mirrored my own. My mother's eyes darted between us again, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. You're my son," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "My own son." I wanted to say something, anything, to make this better. But there was nothing. Nothing could fix this. The reality of what we'd done was out in the open now, and there was no turning back. I felt my father shift beside me, his hand reaching out as if to comfort her, but she recoiled immediately, her face contorting with disgust. "Don't touch me," she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. "Don't you dare touch me." He dropped his hand, his expression crumbling as the weight of her rejection hit him. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. Tears were streaming down her face now, her body trembling as she struggled to keep herself composed. I don't understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking with each word. "How could you do this? How could you both do this to me?" Her words cut through me like a knife. I had never seen her like this, so broken, so shattered. I had always thought of her as strong, as someone who could handle anything. But now, she looked like a ghost of herself, fragile and lost. My father finally found his voice, though it was shaky and unsure. I'm sorry," he stammered, his eyes filled with guilt. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Sorry," she repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "You're sorry? That's all you have to say?" I could see the rage building in her, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She wasn't just angry, she was devastated. The betrayal was written all over her face, and there was nothing either of us could do to undo it. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing as she looked at both of us like we were strangers, like she didn't recognize us anymore. "You're both disgusting," she spat, her voice shaking with fury. "I trusted you. I trusted you both. And this is how you repay me." I felt my chest tighten, the guilt suffocating me. I had never seen her so hurt, so completely destroyed. I wanted to say something to explain, but what could I say? How could I possibly make this right? "I can't," she began, her voice breaking again. "I can't even look at you." She turned away from us, her hands coming up to cover her face as she let out a strangled sob. The sound tore through the room, filling the silence with a pain that was almost unbearable. My stomach twisted, and I felt sick to my core.